Tempest-Tost, The Refugee Experience Through One Community's Prism. Written by Robert V. Dodge. Narrated by Benjamin Fife. Brought to you by Wild Blue Press. Chapter 1. Introduction. The ordeals refugees survive, and the aspirations they hold resonate with us as Americans. This country was built by people who fled oppression and war, leapt at opportunity, and worked day and night to remake themselves in this new land. The refugees who arrive in the United States today continue this tradition, bringing fresh dreams and energy and renewing the qualities that help forge our national identity and make our country strong. This was how Barack Obama described refugees in 2014 as the United States welcomed 70,000 new residents who were fleeing oppression and war. A year later, Donald Trump was on the scene, and he said, "So we have a president that wants to take hundreds of thousands of people and move them into our country." He ominously warned that refugees could be a better, bigger, more horrible version than the legendary Trojan horse ever was. A heated national debate has emerged over refugees coming to the U.S. in recent years. There are those who present refugees as a threat to security in America, while others view welcoming refugees as the tradition that made the country strong and diverse. This book looks at refugees who have settled in Colorado, focusing on the Denver metropolitan area. The intent is to elevate the discussion by helping the reader realize what people endured before becoming refugees, and how they have managed since arriving in America. To consider the role refugees have played and should play in America, it is of value to hear their stories and understand their struggles, what they contribute, and what problems they face that could represent problems to the communities in which they are settled. A point sometimes ignored in the current discussion is that the original English settlers in New England were refugees. While many have fled war and abuse throughout history, the word refugee entered the language during the religious wars in Europe following the Protestant Reformation. That Reformation came to England with Henry VIII, who broke with the Catholic Church and declared himself the head of the Church of England. Some felt the New English Church remained too similar to Catholicism and hoped to bring it closer to Calvinism and purify it, earning themselves the name Puritans. Those Puritans who were willing to remain within the Anglican Church and work to change it were the nonconformists. A second group of Puritans chose to remove itself completely from the Church of England, and these were the Separatists. This group was especially persecuted. Pilgrim leader and Mayflower passenger William Bradford reported that during the reign of Queen Elizabeth, many Separatists were imprisoned and murdered, and survivors petitioned the Queen that they may not be murdered by hunger and cold and stifled in loathsome dungeons. When James I came to the throne following the death of Elizabeth, the situation grew worse, and separatist groups became refugees. A group left England in 1608 and secured a settlement in Holland. In 1620, a separatist group led by Bradford became refugees from England and boarded the Mayflower, reaching North America after over 2 months at sea, and they created the colony of Plymouth. There exists a myth that they came for religious freedom, but they came to practice their own religion and established an intolerant theocracy. This second permanent British colony in America was founded by refugees from religious persecution and physical abuse who were seeking a better life, and set the model for the colony, which would become a recurring pattern throughout U.S. history. Since Plymouth, there has been a home in America for those fleeing danger and persecution. It wasn't until after World War II, when 250,000 refugees came to the U.S., that the country passed its first law specifically allowing for the admission of displaced people. This was followed by the Cold War, and laws were passed to allow the admission of those fleeing communist countries. Those escaping countries behind the Iron Curtain were joined by refugees from China, North Korea, and many Cubans. The fall of Saigon in 1975 led to the challenge of resettling hundreds of thousands of refugees from Vietnam. Congress responded by passing the Refugee Act of 1980. In passing the act, Congress standardized the definition and government-supported services available for refugees. The Refugee Act specified 5 categories of persecution a person might suffer from that would qualify them for refugee status: race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, and political opinion. Proof of being a victim of one of these would be a requirement when applying for admission to the U.S. Also included was considerable specific direction to states accepting refugees regarding assistance and monitoring, as well as obligations for refugees to follow. From 1975, when the Vietnamese resettlement began, through mid-2015, the U.S. resettled over 3 million refugees in its borders from over 70 nations. While that has been substantial, it is not in keeping with the recent increase in displacement of people from their homes. Civil wars and famine have resulted in unprecedented numbers of refugees in recent years, and as 2016 began, 65.3 million people were displaced from their homes. New refugees are added at a rate of 24 per minute, and their numbers approach 1% of the Earth's population. A limit of 50,000 refugees per year was set in the original act, subject to change as the President determines, before the beginning of the fiscal year, is justified by humanitarian concerns or is otherwise in the national interest. Humanitarian concern has seen the number of refugees admitted vary considerably over the years. In 1980, when the act was passed, an all-time high of over 207,000 were taken into the country. This included the Vietnamese boat people and others escaping from communist Southeast Asia. The numbers soon were lowered, but when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1989, there were again well over 100,000 refugees entering the U.S. annually for several years, with a large influx of Russians and others from Eastern European countries that had been part of the Soviet bloc. This was followed by a brief spike in 1999, following the genocide in Kosovo. Following 9/11 and the Patriot Act, admission of refugees dropped to an all-time low of 27,000 in 2002. President Bush called for 70,000 for 2007, but Congress reduced that number to 50,000. In 2008, refugee status was granted to thousands of Burmese and Bhutanese, and within years, Burma annually ranked first or second as the country of origin for refugees, while Bhutan ranged from third to fifth. The civil war in Syria resulting in millions of refugees who flooded Europe. German Chancellor Angela Merkel opened the doors and welcomed them. Named Time magazine's Person of the Year for 2015, Merkel said, "If we now have to start apologizing for showing a friendly face in response to emergency situations, then that's not my country." President Obama increased the refugee number to be admitted and added 10,000 Syrian refugees in his 2015 proposal. The governors of 24 states responded by saying their states would not accept any. Obama admitted 85,000 refugees in his final year of office, and, for the first time in history, Muslims admitted outnumbered Christians, 46% to 44%. There was a drumbeat of alarm over the admission of Syrians and Muslims from other countries, and often the entire program of refugee admissions became related to the issues associated with these concerns. One of the states that has been willing to accept refugees since the program was formalized is Colorado. When many state governors had said they would not allow any Syrian refugees within their borders, Governor Hickenlooper of Colorado accepted them and called for the state to provide a place where the world's most vulnerable can rebuild their lives. Since the Refugee Act in 1980 through 2015, the state of Colorado processed 50,207 refugees for resettlement, and the state receives approximately 2,500 refugees per year from countries worldwide. The largest number has come from Vietnam, where nearly 110,000 have resettled. The first-generation refugees, whose incoming numbers began to decline in the 1980s, were down to double digits in the 90s. By 2010, there were no new Vietnamese arrivals, and many in Colorado are largely adapted to U.S. life. The second largest group has been the 6,000 from the Soviet Union, Russian Republic, most arriving in the 1990s. This dropped off in the new millennium and was down to single-digit arrivals following 2010. While many came to Colorado from Somalia at the beginning of the 21st century, the large influx of refugees in recent years has come from Burma and Bhutan, with thousands of each arriving in the years since 2007. The vast majority of these newcomers have been settling in the Denver-Aurora metropolitan area. Denver, called the Mile High City, is connected to Aurora with a combined population of 1 million people. They're located on the front range of the Rocky Mountains and have mainly sunny days and a dry climate. The mountainous terrain near Denver and Aurora make the location not quite so dramatic a change for one group that has been placed there for resettlement from a much more mountainous region, the Bhutanese. In the current controversy, there are claims that refugees represent a general threat stemming from several incidents of terrorism. These have not involved refugees. The threat posed by refugees is not borne out by evidence, only suggestions of possibilities. As the right-wing leaning Cato Institute pointed out in a recent study noted, the chance of an American being murdered in a terrorist attack caused by a refugee is 1 in 3.64 billion per year. Chapter 2. Georgette, Congo. Georgette is living a relatively unnoticed life as a refugee in Denver, Colorado, after fleeing conditions that defy sympathy. First meeting Georgette and seeing her welcoming smile as she greets visitors to the office, one would not think of what she had endured to be where she was. Her original home, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, was known as Zaire in her youth. She was made a refugee in her home country in 1997 after the first of 2 overlapping civil wars broke out the previous year. Thinking things were better, she returned to her home in time to see the Second Civil War erupt in 1998. She was soon again a refugee in her own country, and eventually, in the early 2000s, managed to escape the Congo and head to South Africa. Human Rights Watch, HRW, described the Congo at that time as enduring the deadliest wars in the world. More specifically, HRW reported in 2006 that in the previous 8 years, 3.5 million had died, and every day more than 1,200 civilians were losing their lives in the country. After years as a refugee in a second country, chance would land Georgette far away in the puzzling new culture of a third home, Denver. Circumstances dictated the path of Georgette's life. She was born into emerging, interrelating conflicts, including a challenge to the corrupt 31-year rule of the Congo by Mobutu, who would benefit from the Congo's vast wealth in mineral deposits and the presence of warlords. As is frequently the case in refugee stories, underlying causes of the clashes date back to the age of imperialism, when boundaries were imposed upon areas that did not relate to tribal or ethnic realities, or one group received preference over others. An outgrowth of that was the tragic conflict between the Hutus and the Tutsis that engulfed Zaire and its neighbors. Hutu's name means cultivators, and they based their lives on growing crops. They first settled in the area surrounding the east side of the Congo between 500 to 1000 BC. About 400 years ago, a nomadic people from Ethiopia, the Tutsi, also known as the Watusi, began to settle in what was the kingdom of Rwanda. Eventually, the Tutsis intermingled with the Hutus and adopted their language, beliefs, and customs. The Tutsis were cattle herders, and that generally made them economically superior to the farming Hutus. In many areas, this economic advantage led to social and political superiority, and they became rulers of the Hutus. A pygmy group, the Twa, settled among them. While Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa groups existed before Europeans arrived, they were not exclusive categories. Europeans arrived and divided the continent into colonies, and the Kingdom of Rwanda became part of German East Africa. The racist scholarship of Europe that was prevalent in the late 19th century was brought to Africa. They transformed the groups of their colonies in the East Congo area into ethnic identities that polarized and politicized with devastating results. Prior to European colonization, the tribes were based largely on social status and considered part of a single social structure. It was possible for a Hutu to do well and become a Tutsi, and vice versa, and all 18 clans in the Kingdom of Rwanda shared military service, compulsory labor, and a common religion. Following World War I, Germany lost its colonies, and the Kingdom of Rwanda became a Belgian mandate bordering the Congo named Rwanda-Urundi. The hostiles that colonial powers created were repressed by colonial rule, and independence came in 1962 when Rwanda-Urundi split into two countries, Rwanda and Burundi. Ethnic problems soon came to the surface, including a 1972 genocide of Hutus in Burundi. There were other major communal massacres, such as the 1993 mass slaughter of Tutsis in Burundi. Rwandan Hutus gained political dominance over the Tutsis after independence, as they were 90% of the population. Exiled Tutsis formed the Rwandan Patriotic Army, RPA, in Uganda and attempted unsuccessfully to invade Rwanda in 1990. Zaire's Mobutu sent his country's forces to aid the Hutu government of Rwanda. On April 6, 1994, the presidents of both Rwanda and Burundi were killed when the plane they were in was shot down by a surface-to-air missile fired by what were presumed to be Hutu extremists. This sparked the murder of 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus by Hutu extremists throughout Rwanda during the next 100 days in the Rwandan genocide. The Tutsi RPA conquered Kigali, the capital of Rwanda, and ousted the Hutu government. Fearing Tutsi revenge, an estimated 1.2 million Hutus fled Rwanda into eastern Zaire, including 40,000 of the militia responsible for the genocide. Mobutu agreed to host Hutu refugees in camps in Zaire, including organized militia groups that were using the camps to launch attacks against Rwanda. Rwanda first entered Zaire to attack the refugee camps for its own security and revenge against the Hutu militants responsible for the genocide. But, as other countries were drawn into the fighting, their focus changed to the overthrow of Mobutu's government. These were the circumstances when Georgette was first forced to flee her home. She was from a comparatively wealthy family in Kinshasa, the Congo's capital and largest city, where her father was a business executive. The uprising had begun against the country's president Mobutu, and rebels threatened the capital in a very bloody conflict. Georgette was just 14 at the time when she saw war enter her life. She recalled, "Wake up in the morning, you can see people. They are dying. Start killing almost everybody." Soon they were off. "One of my dad's friends, he come to the house one night. They been shooting everywhere. They tell us like, run the city where he was living. Everybody for cover." Run they did. "We left our beautiful house," she said. That would mark the beginning of an exile that had no happy ending for the family. The struggle that gripped the Congo had roots in tribal rivalries that also haunted its 9 immediate neighbors, 7 of which were endemically or acutely unstable, and 5 that would actively contribute to the downfall of Mobutu's regime. Her family left the city, and they hoped to escape from the country by walking toward eastern Zaire, a daunting challenge. "We left everything, walking, just trying to survive. Congo was too big." The Congo is the 11th largest country on Earth, and the home Georgette's family left in Kinshasa was in the far west. She and her family hoped to leave Zaire by walking to the African Great Lakes region, nearly 1,000 miles to the east, through hot, humid equatorial jungle. The African Great Lakes, sometimes referred to as the Grand Lakes, are a string of large lakes including Lake Victoria, Lake Tanganyika, Lake Malawi, Lake Albert, and others in and around the East African Rift Valley, located in Zaire, Uganda, Burundi, and Rwanda. What made it uniquely difficult was that Georgette's mother had just given birth to a baby boy 3 days before they set out and was still bleeding and hemorrhaging from the recent birth. Obviously, the newborn child had to be carried, and this duty fell to the weakened mother. The family struggled on, even though "we were so tired, on foot, no water." Georgette's concerns at the time were not personal, as she noted, "I was not feeling bad for myself, but for my mom, with the baby in her hand, no water, no nothing." This was the conflict that Georgette's family was passing through. There were 4 government armies, 2 former government armies, and over a dozen rebel groups and ethnic militias involved in violent confrontation in the Congo. Amazingly, they eventually managed to reach the east of Zaire. Georgette described the trek. "We tried to go like Rwanda. There was no way. We tried to go Uganda, but you see, people was being killed in the streets, you cannot believe." They waited in the Great Lakes, hoping things would settle down. The carnage of war surrounded them. "You can smell people. We are in the Grand Lakes. Grand Lakes, you can see the bodies stand up in the lakes like trash because they had been killed. Blood everywhere, smelling." Mobutu had been suffering from prostate cancer since early in the Civil War, and his condition grew worse. Tutsi rebels were led by Laurent Kabila, whose forces soon controlled much of northern and eastern Zaire. Tens of thousands of Hutus that had conducted the Rwanda genocide came to the fight to save Mobutu. This was offset in early 1997 as the Angolan army entered the war on the side of the rebels, and the European mercenaries, who had been supporting Mobutu, withdrew from the fighting since they hadn't been paid. Nelson Mandela and others attempted to intervene to negotiate a settlement between Mobutu and the Hutus, and the widely supported Kabila's rebel forces, who advanced on the capital, Kinshasa. There were rumors that the U.S. became involved in the ouster of Mobutu to ensure a $1 billion contract for an American firm that would gain control of mineral wealth in Zaire, though these claims lack convincing substantiation. In May 1997, rebel forces moved through Kinshasa and Mobutu fled for his life. His escape didn't buy him much time, as he died of cancer in Morocco 4 months later. For Georgette, this might have seemed like welcome news, since at last they were no longer in the middle of a war zone. After months, everything became calm. The rebels took the city. They began going into the capital, as she recalled. The people who had been in power when they were forced to flee were no longer in charge, but it was uncertain who was. They were cautious and didn't rush. 6 months later, my dad said we can just now go back to Kinshasa. Our plan was we went through Rwanda, Burundi, Tanzania. It took us 3 months to come back to Congo. The return did not mean resuming the style of existence they had once had. Life for Georgette was not about to improve. Laurent Kabila proclaimed himself president, and the country was renamed the Democratic Republic of the Congo. But old problems of corruption and ethnic rivalries did not vanish. They were soon to explode in great violence. The troubles began immediately for Georgette's family, as she explains. "It was difficult for us to live there because my dad had been arrested for when he was trying to cross the border." With her dad removed, the glue that had held them together dissolved. In August of 1998, just over a year after Kabila had come to power, rebels backed by Uganda and Rwanda advanced in the east of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, supported by troops from Angola, Zimbabwe, Chad, Sudan, and Namibia. They sent in troops that sided with the Kabila regime in the rapidly expanding Second Civil War. For Georgette, the situation had again become intolerable. "My mom had, 7 kids, and we couldn't survive in my country. We couldn't survive in Kinshasa because we didn't have house." They left during the war, but not together this time. "You became a refugee in the same country." A ceasefire was signed in 1999, but the fighting continued. On July 16, 2001, Kabila was assassinated, and his son Joseph would be named head of state in October 2002. Corruption never declined from the Mobutu years. The outside world took little notice of all this, since Africa rarely received media attention. That neglect is a continuing part of the story of the sub-Saharan continent. It really was the worst of times. To make the experience of people like Georgette and others understandable, Vava Tampa wrote a comparative study, Why the World is Ignoring Congo War. He stated, "The wars in that country have claimed nearly the same number of lives as having a 9/11 every single day for 360 days. The genocide that struck Rwanda in 1994, the ethnic cleansing that overwhelmed Bosnia in the mid-1990s, the genocide that took place in Darfur, the number of people killed in the Great Tsunami that struck in Asia in 2004, and the number of people who died in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, all combined and then doubled." Georgette fled in the midst of this carnage, and a new refugee chapter was soon underway in her life. She headed to South Africa when she was 16 years old, and this time she was on her own. She would not see her mother again until after she had become a U.S. resident. There were many refugees displaced by the continuing war, and Georgette followed them. In her words, "Myself, being a teenager, because transportation was so difficult, I just follow people in front of me that would be running. Whilst being a refugee in her own country had been extremely challenging and dangerous, she had been with family, which provided some support. Life in South Africa as a refugee, being a young woman and on her own, would be a different experience. Georgette recalls, "That was difficult, I can tell you. I know what it is to be sad, hungry, happy, sad, everything. I had my experience. I've been sitting maybe 5 days, no food, drinking just water." Whether the emotional damage she suffered in South Africa was worse than the danger she faced in the Congo is unclear, but it is unfortunate that anyone should spend her life growing up surviving and coping with such conditions. She was out of the horror of killing, but she was a young woman, alone in a strange land. She was in a refugee camp, which was where she began going through processing in the United Nations Refugee Program. She was allowed to leave camp and, so like all teenagers, a young lady, I tried to survive myself. I looked for a job in a restaurant because I was speaking French. Her family in Zaire had provided her with a good education, and French was the common language to learn when she was young for those who attended schools, though she would eventually speak 5 languages. She was hired by a restaurant. It was not bad. Her salary was only about $10 a month, but she was happy to work there, because the job made me feel a little bit like home. She was lonely and poor, and desperation set in. Sometimes walk in street, sometimes sleep in street. It was soon more than sleeping on the street. I was drinking alcohol. Sometimes you have to stay and drink alcohol all night and sleep outside and wake up in morning because you don't have nowhere to go. Drinking and staying out all night sleeping on the streets was not an indication life was going well for Georgette as a refugee in South Africa. She spent 4 years in the refugee camp, but provisions were scarce, and her job didn't add much to move her beyond subsistence. She observed, "A lot of the young refugees, girls, they've been abused by the person that have money. You don't have a choice. You want to stay here? Well, I'll give you where to sleep. I'll take care of you. Yeah, they will do anything they want to do with you." It was the voice of experience speaking. Some might think of it as a win-win situation, since both parties in the arrangement benefit, but it is surely exploitation of the most vulnerable, who are too desperate and have no protection from sexual predators who abuse them. In Georgette's case, it led to her pregnancy. "I became a mom. I was 22, she said. She soon found that her situation had been processed by the UN and learned that she was eligible for the third and final choice for refugees, resettlement. The first option is repatriation, the second, integration in the country where they have taken refuge, and the final option is resettlement in a third country. It might be expected that after living with the slaughter in the Congo, then exploitation in South Africa, Georgette would have been overjoyed to hear that she was heading for the USA. That was not the case. Her reaction was, "With the assistance, they say, we have a program. We can take this single person to the United States. Why America? Why you not sent to France or to Belgium, where I am speaking my French?" They told me, "You going to America?" I say, "Oh, I knew it wasn't easy to come to America." She was aware it would be a challenge as a young black woman from Africa, and as she added, "I knew it was difficult because I came with my first child. She was only 3 months. Georgette was a single mom. She arrived thinking, there was nothing for me. Nothing's changed. I tell myself I'm alive. I can die tomorrow, like every other person who is close to me, a corpse. I saw people die every day." It was 8 years ago when Georgette became a refugee for the third and hopefully final time, when she came to America. She says, "Now I'm good," and Colorado is feeling like home. She has a steady job as a receptionist and looks after her daughter, who is a big girl now. She's 8 years. Georgette has strived hard and adjusted, but with a mix of acceptance and some regret. "I am not as alive again. No missing food, but so difficult in the United States." She doesn't think she will completely become a typical Coloradan. For her, after 8 years, it is still survival, not pleasure. "I never thinking I'm going to ski, go watching Broncos game. I think, like working. How can I go to school? How can I help my mom?" In all the confusion of the Congo wars, her mom ended up imprisoned in France, and Georgette made a trip to visit her. This first reunion, since the separation of Georgette leaving Kinshasa, has left a strained relationship she hopes to avoid with her own daughter. Life has been a continuing serious struggle for Georgette. She would have liked to have become a nurse, but never had the opportunity to receive the training. She has yet to tell her daughter her story, and there will be a time for that. She explains, "I think that she is not ready. She needs more time to see the trauma. I don't want to tell her my past right now." Georgette doesn't pity herself, but she sees her story as the standard refugee story. They vary on interest in returning to their countries of origin, but a common thread among the original arrivals is preservation of their cultures and traditions in this new world. In her words, "The refugees, we are missing something inside. Something's missing. In Africa, we don't have a lot of opportunity, but we have love and happiness. It's something I'm missing. You are far away from your family, far away from your culture, far away from your beautiful food, your culture that has singing and dancing. It's something we're missing now." Considering the daily death and exploitation Georgette encountered, and the poverty and devastation of her life in Africa, perhaps it is a reflection on U.S. culture that even though there is wealth, food, opportunity, she can say what is missing is love and happiness. Chapter 3. From Colonialism to Refugees. Georgette's story illustrates the problem that is at the root of many refugee stories. Often the conditions in the world that refugees are fleeing were created by Europeans during their domination of much of the globe. Trade had existed across the Eurasian landmass since ancient times, while the Americas were isolated. In the 15th century, the small continent of Europe was the most technologically advanced, and great wealth was possible if a water route to the goods of the East could be found that bypassed the long, hazardous voyage by land. Spain and Portugal were the early leaders in these ventures. In the 1494 Treaty of Tordesillas, the world was audaciously divided between the two of them by the papal line of demarcation. Spanish conquistadores, having removed the Moors from Spain, headed to America for gold, glory, and God. The Aztec and Inca empires were defeated, and gold flowed to Spain, while Catholicism and Spanish became enduring legacies. Portugal claimed only Brazil in America, but had the water route to Asia around Africa, and set up trading posts and colonies. These early encounters would have devastating results for the American people, as the Europeans brought smallpox and other diseases that would ravage the populations. Africans would also be affected, as the transatlantic slave trade was introduced to provide free labor for exploiting American resources. These profitable 16th century ventures were followed in the 17th century in both America and Asia by the French, English, and Dutch. The colonies of this era were maritime, based on naval supremacy, and mercantile, focused on harvesting raw materials for the mother country and creating markets for finished goods. A much more extensive Europeanization of the world came in the late 1800s with the age of imperialism. This followed the rise of nation-states and nationalism combined with industrialization and capitalism. Since Napoleon, the dominant country had been Britain, which was also the leading industrial power and the world's financial center, and it had a widespread colonial empire, including India. When Germany emerged as a new country, Britain had a rival. This initiated a contest to expand empires throughout the Middle East, Africa, and Asia until the entire world was largely dominated by Europe. The small island of Britain acquired the largest empire in world history, gaining control of a quarter of the Earth's land and governing a quarter of its population. Many Europeans struggled to compete as Russia expanded across the landmass of Eurasia and was by far the largest country in area. The scramble for claiming Africa and Asia had several competitors, with the British, French, and Germans being the largest players. Late outside entrants were the United States and Japan, but the major struggle was Western Europe. There were nationalist motives for this, and economically, the raw materials needed for new industry were available only in underdeveloped areas. It was a racist time when white Europeans' attitudes about claiming territory found support in social Darwinism, which contended that whites had evolved farther and were the proper rulers of inferior people. There were many devoted Christians who felt it was their duty to convert the heathens of the less developed world. Some also felt the superior whites had a duty to bring advances of Western culture to the lesser races. This was the civilizing mission that Rudyard Kipling wrote of in his 1899 poem, The White Man's Burden. Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness, on fluttered folk and wild, your new-caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child. The major change that accompanied the new imperialism was that countries claiming territory were supported by companies that didn't plan to just trade, but expected to make large investments in infrastructure, such as railroads, mines, warehouses, steamships to gain access to the resources they were seeking. To be sure this was achieved, they wanted complete political and territorial domination. This was really sparked by the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 85, and its final act, Article 35, that required effective control of territories reclaimed. Unlike earlier colonialism, where countries could stake claim to territories and rule them from abroad, actual occupation of the land would be required for a nation's claim to be considered legitimate. The people in the areas they claimed were going to be their subjects, and in some cases, reduced to their slaves. Little attention was paid to existing social and political structures. While some colonies like India gained advanced infrastructures as Europeans profited and controlled power, others were harshly exploited. Africa, especially the sub-Saharan, was where the frantic scramble for grabbing territory began with the least restraint. The Dark Continent was made up of tribes, ethnicities, chiefdoms, kingdoms, warlords, where village life and nomadic wandering was the most common lifestyle, and people's loyalties were overlapping. Boundaries were indistinct and related to the changing tribal rivalries or other conflicts. The European concept of the nation-state was not an African concept, but was suddenly imposed upon it, as it would be on Asian colonies that contained mixed identities. South Africa had been settled in an earlier land grab, and Europe's method and aggressiveness is illustrated in Georgette's home, the Congo. This is where the rush to partition sub-Saharan Africa began. The case is illustrative of African exploitation and the worst of imperialism. The African explorer Henry Stanley ventured deep through unknown Africa. He saw the Congo River basin and was convinced it had economic potential. Stanley eventually convinced King Leopold II of Belgium to sponsor an expedition up the Congo, and when he returned, he had over 500 legal documents tribal chiefs had marked with an X in exchange for trinkets. The chiefs couldn't read the documents, and contracts were a meaningless concept to them, but what they had unknowingly agreed to was to give all their territory to Leopold and promise to provide workers for his projects. In 1884, the Congress of Berlin recognized Leopold as the head of the Congo Free State, the world's only private colony. Leopold claimed this was a humanitarian venture, that he was protecting the natives from Arab slave traders and bringing them Christianity. He borrowed money from the Belgian government to finance his enterprise, and began demanding that the Congo produce 2 million pounds of ivory per year for export. But change came when inflatable rubber tires became marketable for bicycles and later automobiles. The great demand for rubber, which was available in the Congo jungle, led Leopold to send his army to the colony, where they went to villages and forced men to join work gangs for the concession companies that would provide for the insatiable demand. Women and children were taken as hostages to force the men to collect rubber. There was resistance, and soldiers were sent out with a known number of bullets that were only to be used on the local population. They were ordered to bring back